10 seconds. Hi, everybody. I'm Carol Kaufman, the founder of the Institute of Coaching with Margaret Moore and Susan David. And I am here with Safi Bahcall, who is a genius. He is a second-generation physicist, has hung out with Nobel laureates most of his life. From there, he traveled to McKinsey, where he consulted, or as he said, it's the halfway house between physicist and public company CEO, where he started a biotech to help cure cancer. Then he did a bunch of things. One of the things was he was on President Obama's Council of Science Advisors talking about the future of research. And along the way, he has summed up years of great stories, great science, and great things about leadership in his book called Loonshots, which is both entertaining and very informative. And I love it because it's sort of like the stuff that those of us know. And then you take us right to the cusp of physics where we can still understand you without falling over the cliff. So Loonshots is a lovely book. And Safi, why don't you just start wherever you want?
Well, thanks. I do very few of these podcasts now because I'm deep in the cave on a research project. So I came out of my cave because I'm such a fan of yours and what you do at the Institute of Coaching, and Susan David, as we talked about, another really good mutual friend. I think you guys do a terrific job for leaders, for CEOs, for senior leadership teams. So I'm excited to come talk to you also because you're just a really fun, interesting person, and we'll have some fun.
All right. So, Safi, why am I holding up water and ice cubes?
Funny you mention. I do start the Loonshots books with the story about water and ice, and that is directly that helps bridge kind of what I talk about in Loonshots, which is how to be a better leader, how to design an organization to innovate faster and better, to help nurture those wild seeming, crazy seeming ideas without dropping the ball on your core franchise. And kind of
wait. I forgot to ask you to describe what are Loonshots so that people know.
Yeah, well, everybody knows what a moonshot is. It's this big goal and some destination that, everybody can get excited about. And it came from John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s, saying we would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the real breakthroughs, the ones that change the course of a company, of an organization, of a nation, of you personally, most of those breakthroughs weren't some wildly applauded big idea. They were seemingly dismissed, crazy ideas that everybody said, oh, that'd never work. And there wasn't a good word in that for that in the English language, so I made one up. All right, since we're kind of live and doing funny digression, want to hear a funny story?
No.
I do. No?
Of course I do.
I do a lot. I get a ton of speaking requests, like, a lot of folks probably in the audience. Since Loonshots came out, I've been doing them regularly, and I got one. I won't mention any names, but the organizer invited me, a large collection of, CEOs. And I was sitting down at the dinner. It was a dinner event. And I sit down next to her. And one of the first things she says is, I didn't know Loonshots was a word. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh, yeah, well, that's because I made it up, because there wasn't a good word for, these seemingly crazy ideas that are dismissed. And she said, no. I looked it up on the internet. It's a word. I was like, I'm just going to move on from here. I'm just going to let that one go. Anyways, that's what a loonshot is. There wasn't a good phrase for that, so I used that. Mm-hmm. But the point of that is, and the connection to the glass of water and this, and the ice, and is very relevant to kind of leadership coaching, working with executive teams. If you are a leader, if you're running almost any size organization where something has worked. You have found product market fit. Either you're a leader, or you're an established dominant player, and you have an amazing franchise, or you're an emerging growth company that's one of your products has really succeeded. And you found a niche. You need to figure out you're at this inflection point. You're not in that little baby phase, kindergarten, product market product. But you're not yet at the Amazon, Google, Microsoft, IBM dominating the world phase. You're at this inflection point, which is a very exciting, interesting point because it could go either way. You could become the Blockbusters, the Blackberries of the world that just disappear, kind of end up in the toilet. Or if you figure out this one thing, you can rise to the next level. And that one thing is about building a system. Finding those changes that help you run experiments at pace and scale so that you can balance the core and the new. Now, what does it have to do with water and ice? And so kind of the theme of Loonshots is that there are these system changes, structural changes. And the example is a glass of water. You raised one. So here's my glass of water, which I brought for drinking. But think of room temperature water, any liquid, coffee, orange juice. When I stick my finger in, I swirl it around all the molecules inside those water, or just swirl around my finger. And that's true for any liquid. And water is just one example. But as I lower the temperature, right at 32 Fahrenheit, boom, the behavior of those molecules completely changes. And they become totally rigid. Now, if I want a glass of water if I want it liquid, if I want to be able to drink it, do I go to a giant block of ice and say, hey, molecules, could you just loosen up and shake around a little bit and, be squishy and innovative and just do all sorts of stuff? Please, please. What does that block of ice do? Nothing. They're like most big organizations. When you show them videos of people holding hands and singing Kumbaya and put up nice posters on the wall about innovation, it changes nothing, because you don't drive change through talking about culture, through begging. You drive change with those small changes in temperature. See, all the yelling and pleading at a bunch of molecules will do nothing, but a small change in temperature will melt ice. A small change in temperature can melt steel. And so that's what the book is about, and what the ideas are about, which is what are these small changes in structure that can transform a team from going this rigid, very familiar large organization, or even medium to large organization, where ideas get crushed. All sorts of ideas come up from the bottom, but they get crushed at some point. And I spend so much time with so many CEOs and leaders who are at that kind of inflection point, and they're like, of course, we really desperately want to innovate, but we can't figure it out. I mean, these are some very successful CEOs who have multi-billion P&L, and they've gone from 10 people to 1,000 people or a few thousand people, and they're overseeing these very large P&Ls, and they're like, obviously, we don't want to lose, right? There's no CEO that says, you know what I'd really like to do is crush innovative ideas. That's my dream. None of them say that. They all say the opposite, and they're confused, like it's just not working. Why? Because you think showing Kumbaya movies and nice posters is what innovation is about. Because you think, reading a BuzzFeed article about the 7 tricks to innovate, take a warm bath or walk with your dog or something is what it's about. It's not about. It's about building a system. And as your organization grows, as your team grows, your job, and this is kind of one of the things I work on with, especially CEOs who are at that inflection point between the Amazons of the startups and the Amazon world and can go either way, your job shifts from the how and the what, the tasks. We must get this done. What's the matter with you? You didn't get this done on time, on budget. To the who and the system. Who's going to be doing this? How should I organize? what are the equivalent of the small changes in temperature I can make in my structure in my system? So I'll give you another example of what I mean by from the water and the ice of small changes in structure. So let's say it rains overnight. You're in New England, you're in Boston, so you know what happens on your sidewalk, right? It freezes.
Mm-hmm.
We do this in California, and like people are like, "Yeah, no idea what you're talking about." and on the sidewalk, and it freezes. Now, what do you do if you want to not wake up in the morning and step in a puddle and and slip and end up in the hospital? You sprinkle salt on your sidewalk. Why? It's a small change in structure. It lowers the binding energy between the molecules in the water. It makes them more likely to slosh around. So the freezing point goes down. That's what you want to do inside organizations. Yes, there is a role for culture and leadership mindset and certain mindsets, which I do talk about. You don't want to be flogging people every Tuesday morning in public. That's not a good idea. You're not going to get a very risk-taking kind of environment. But you also want to balance that by thinking about what are the equivalent of sprinkling salt? What is the equivalent of changing temperature? How do I create the right systems? How do I create, one set of structure and incentives and communication and organization for the artists, the people who are working on the crazy new ideas where I want them to fail? Because if they're not failing, I have a very big problem. They're playing it safe. And the soldiers inside your organization, which are focused on time, on budget, on spec, consistently with quality to customers. Because if I have a sales guy knocking on a customer's door and saying, "Here, sir, here's your toaster," and he said, "Toaster, I ordered a television. What are you doing?" Well, you're not going to have a business for very long. So you need both of these, the very different structure. One, you want to increase risk and increase the failure rate. One, you want to decrease risk and decrease the failure rate. And you need to be measuring them on different things. You need to be reporting on different things. You need to be analyzing in different ways. You need to be communicating different topics and different incentive systems. And you need to manage the touch and the balance between those two groups if you're the leader. So that gets to the sort of the longer answer to your question of the water and the ice. It's a helpful metaphor for those people who are mathematically inclined or engineers. There's an actual mathematical model, which is sort of in the appendix and makes that more rigorous, what's called a phase transition in science, when a glass of water shifts from solid to liquid, or traffic flow on a highway shift from smooth flow suddenly to jammed flow. If you've ever been driving and all of a sudden you have this parking lot of stalled cars, that's also a phase transition. And the point of the book is that happens inside companies. And a different way to think about your role as a leader, or a complementary way, is to say you're in charge of this system and you want to create these two phases. If you want to balance the core and the new, do well on your franchise, do well on exploring the new, you need to understand that these are two phases, water and ice. And your job is to manage the touch and the balance between these two phases. And so, we can't do all of that in 30 minutes, but that's sort of the gist of it. And by the way, since this is all among friends, I actually see in the chat here some friends. There's Andrew Novak and all sorts of people from our mutual friend group. If people email me, safi@bahcall.com, I'll send you some of the material. You can read about it a little bit more.
So, as I'm listening to you, tell me if I'm on target or not, because I'm sort of thinking about you're providing the structure for serendipity. People suddenly discover things, but you're talking about the structure that can help make that happen. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think you and I talked about that a little bit earlier. Over the last few years, is that one of the things I talk with CEOs about. Now, I do work one-on-one with CEOs. I do work with leadership teams. I do kind of much more intense workshops with leadership teams that take a day or two, where we really get into the weeds of how to apply this inside an organization. And some aspect of that, what helps me is just having been in that operating role as a CEO for 13 years, or public company for most of it. It's kind of easier for me to directly relate to what's on the mind of the CEO. How do you explain this to a board? How do you explain this to an executive team? You know, who do you have you can talk to without fear, without, you can't really talk to your board of directors. This is why I think coaching is so valuable, or it's leadership coaching, or having someone you can trust and talk to, the kind of role that you and Susan play, or I do for a few CEOs, is because let's say you're not sure about your CFO or something. And well, you really don't want to talk to other folks on the executive team about your doubts about the CFO. That's not a good idea. You also don't want to go to your board and say, the CFO was telling me this thing the other day. I'm just not sure. Because what happens if you change your mind, or you discover something new a week or two later, which happens in real life? Your CFO said something and actually you misheard her, or you misunderstood something. But if you've already talked about it to your board or one of your board members, now what do? You go back to your board member and say, no, I was being an idiot. I didn't read this other thing. Or you throw the CFO under the bus. So it's very valuable to have a coach and or someone you can talk to. And that's a really important role that I wish I'd understood better when I was a CEO. I wish I'd had someone I could confide in that wasn't on my board or wasn't on my executive team, and understood that.
Yeah.
And those are the kind of places that we explore what you just mentioned, which is how do you create two structures internally? Because that can threaten folks on the executive team.
So I have a question about that. Connecting, or coaching the leaders. What are a couple of questions, or how could a coach begin someone make this journey if that's what they were sensing was what was missing?
That's a great question. I hate to say it depends, but
of course it depends. But in addition to that,
the answer depends a little bit on what stage company are we talking about. So I find working with folks at this sort of startup phase, what matters to them and what they ought to be hearing or should be hearing, and the feedback they really need, is very different than when they're at this inflection phase, 500 to 1,000, or a few hundred to a few thousand people. Is still very different from when they're at that, grown-up phase where they're a very large company and it's a department or a division. So those are three sort of very different kinds of discussions and kinds of questions a coach would want to engage in.
Do you want to give us an example from?
Yeah. So I actually spend less of my time with small organizations, with startups, because the VC world, for example, is that's all they do. And that's really their expertise. I find it really much more interesting on the couple hundred where something has already worked. And that's where system really matters.
Yes.
Right? Because if you're 5 people, I don't know that you really need a system. You're like, you don't need who is making what decision. Really, you're making the decision because there are 4 people doing what you say and you see them constantly. Yeah. So you don't really need a system if you're 5 people. But once you get to be 50 or 100 or a few hundred, now you want to shift. So, the kinds of things that a coach would want to ask, of course, depends on the kind of behaviors you're seeing. But for example, and this isn't really just hypothetical since I was one of these guys. If you have one of these leaders who comes from a very logic-driven and task-oriented mindset, which is certainly me because I had a science background, very like, what are the tasks? When do we need to get them done? Are you getting it done? Here's the logic behind why that sucked. Here's the logic behind why what you're saying is wrong. And here's the logic behind why what I'm saying is right, et cetera, et cetera. And especially if they have risen reasonably far, they're probably pretty good at making that logic. That's a disaster. and waiting to happen, as happened for me. What you want to ask them on is, or help them, help by pointing out some of these observations, is partly what got them to the top as being very good at making these arguments is exactly what inhibits their ability to encourage the new. Because if most new things look awful in the beginning, which they do, they look really dumb. The biggest ideas you've heard of, the biggest movies, Ed Catmull's another one in one of our groups that I spend some time with at Pixar. Every movie that they started with looked like a moronic idea. The Star Wars looked like an incredibly dumb idea. You know, it had a space opera, and they had some like silly name like Windy something that sounded like a superhero that farts a lot for the, you know, lead guy. All of the really big breakthroughs look really dumb in the beginning. So if you are a leader who got to the top on, you know, brain power and IQ and logic, you will be really good at shutting those ideas down. You forget as a CEO or any kind of CXO or leader, once you've been there for a while, you forget how intimidating your title and authority are.
Totally.
So even a little bit of like, here's the logic of why your idea will never work, is going to completely crush someone who's coming to you with a new idea. And they're going to give up. And the other people around who see that interaction, especially if you do it in a meeting with other people around listening and watching, because you, as we all know, if you're a leader, you're constantly on display. Everybody's watching every facial gesture for who's in, who's out, what does he or she like, what does he or she not like. If they see you shoot down an idea with your logic and experience, who's going to raise their hand with the next crazy seeming idea? Nobody.
So what kind of questions could you ask? Because I see we're already at 22 minutes of 30. What kind of question can help with that shift?
Is saying, you can ask them, how do you address new ideas where you know, are sure it's a dumb idea? What do you do? Or if you're doing
that's a great
2-on-1 or 3-on-1.
Yeah.
So walk me through what happens when someone suggests an idea that you think is really stupid based on your years of experience. What do you do? Now, what do you think the effect is on the person when you do that? Now, is that the effect you want to have? And almost always it's like, oh, well, I didn't really think about that. And then, oh, yeah, it probably is going to intimidate and shut them down. Because I remember 20 years ago or 10 years ago when I was that junior person or whatever. And is that the effect you want to have? No, I want them to keep coming up with the crazy new ideas to me, because that's where the future is. I don't want to be crushing ideas. Well, the behavior you're doing is kind of crushing ideas. So what are some alternatives? So there are, you know, two magic questions that are alternative to this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, which is what most leaders want to say when presented with an idea that doesn't make sense to them. By the way, the other question is, how many times have you been wrong?
Oh, yeah.
And do you think your batting average is 100%? Nobody will say their batting average is 100. At best, 80%. Really, well, let's talk about those 20%. Do you really want to be shooting down those 20%? How important are those 20%? What if your competitor developed that 20% and you didn't because you crushed it and you were wrong? No, that's really definitely not what I wanted to be doing. So here's sort of two magic questions. One, help me understand. Instead of, this is the stupidest thing, help me understand how you're thinking about this part of the market or this customer segment or where the value is, et cetera. You may be right that they're totally missing something and you may be 100% right, but it's help me understand is a much gentler way that doesn't discourage them from future ideas. Or you may be wrong. Because you actually, as happened to me all the time, when I thought something was a stupid idea, or did you help me understand? I was like, oh, I hadn't thought about it like that. Also, I didn't understand because I'm very busy and I have 50 people and I've got crises and I've got this, leave thing going on and my board member screaming at it. I didn't actually understand correctly the idea. So help me understand is
Mm-hmm.
one magic question that's better. A
Mm-hmm.
second magic question is, instead of this is the stupidest product idea I've heard or service approach, what experiment would you run?
Mm-hmm.
What experiment might we run to test that out? You don't know. You may be thinking that's the dumbest idea, but what is the effect of saying what experiment might we run?
Mm-hmm.
Now you're starting to channel energy into becoming an experimenter.
It's also solution-based rather than criticism-based.
Right. But you're also not giving the answer. You're asking a question. You're saying, as a leader, I don't know what experiment you're in. What experiment do you think we could run? But that's a really useful way to direct someone who has a new idea, because you don't want ideas. You want experiments. Ideas are a dime a dozen. What you
Mm-hmm.
really want is, okay, I hear you think, with this idea, but what experiment could you run? Now we're getting into something, because an experiment is actionable. An experiment is fundable. And when they
Mm-hmm.
say, well, an experiment, I would need to spend a year, I could put together a business plan for you. I talked to marketing and finance and purchasing. I said, what could you do in 5 weeks and $500? What experiment might you run? Now, like, oh, now that's interesting. Now we can have a pretty intriguing debate about what of the business plan, 1 year, $2 million isn't relevant for testing the hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're becoming experimenters. Now, without doing anything, you are starting to create a culture of experimenters.
Mm-hmm.
This is where real innovation happens. This is where real growth happens. If you look at what made, as I talk about in Loonshot, what's made IKEA successful, if you look at what made almost every biotech or biomedical company, Vertex is another local company that's a 10, $20 billion company.
Yeah.
It started off nowhere near as an antiviral, as a nowhere near where it ended up with cystic fibrosis, which was just an experiment that some people were trying to run. Pixar is a very successful movie company. It started off as a computer company. They're trying to sell this 3D, this imaging computer, and Steve Jobs just allowed a few, not willingly, he was dragged. It was Ed Catmull who was like running experiments in the back with a small number of people trying to make actual little movies. So the
Mm-hmm.
real growth, the real innovation comes from running experiments. And as a leader, you want to do a couple things. You want to create these separate structures and systems for your soldiers who are focused on time, on budget, on spec. You need that. But for your artists, you want to ask different questions, measure different things.
Mm-hmm.
As a leader, you want to love your artists and soldiers equally.
Right.
Everybody sees your signaling. If you're overly in love with the shiny new penny, the 95% of your organization that's focused on time, on budget is going to be demotivated and will not perform. And when you leave the room, this won't happen. The artists who have some interesting ideas and experiments but need to work with the soldiers to turn it into a real product, the soldiers and the artists will not get along. Your job
They resent each other.
touch and balance. So
Mm-hmm.
you need to create these separate systems and structures for the water and the ice, the artists and the soldiers. You need to love your artists and soldiers equally, and those can help you balance the core of the new. There's so much more to this. We're like just getting to the tip of the iceberg, but I know we're running on time. So if people email me, I can email them some more stuff.
Well, they can also buy the book. Because one of the things, guys, that's in the book is, Safi is a mathematician at heart. He does math that would crush most of our brains or explode them, either way. But you have sort of this whole magic number thing that you really describe in the book, which is what things do you need to change so that organizations, can in fact melt a bit. And what are the carrots? What are the sticks? So you really sort of spell a lot of that out. So guys, if this is intriguing to you, you should take a look at the book. It's also entertaining. I see, to my shock, we've got like less than a minute left. Thank you for this in terms of very actionable. Wanda is asking if this is recorded. The answer is yes. In fact, the instant it's over, it will be up on the website. I'll also post 2-minute snippets over time on my own LinkedIn. Safi, last pearl of wisdom in 20 seconds.
Listen to the suck with curiosity, LSC. It's, you know, that's the kind of thing that if you really want to create something new and something wonderful, the first version of it, the second version of it, the third version of it won't be great. But the way you will make it great is not just with active listening. Yes, I heard this doesn't resonate for you, but putting on your detective hat, your Columbo hat, your Sherlock Holmes hat, and saying, help me understand what exactly didn't resonate here. People don't want to tell you. Understand that people do not want to tell you because they value their relationship with you. They want you to, for whatever reason, stay in touch with you. So they don't want to tell you what sucks. But that's what you need to know. So listen to the suck with curiosity. Try to set aside your personal emotions if you want to develop something new, and probe in creative ways, like asking a third-party friend to reach out. So that's my cue for the week, or lesson for the week, that I try to do better on, is to keep listening for what's not working well with as much curiosity as I can.
And in one way, you're actually talking about encouraging diversity among your people, that you really want to encourage artists and you want to encourage soldiers and you want them to be able to talk and appreciate each other. So that's just what occurred to me now. So everybody, thank you for being here. Safi, thank you a ton. Guys, to be continued.
Okay.